So today I've been working on the tail. This is my block I glued up, and this piece is quite satisfying to work on. I was able to do one side, and then I realized I had no way of holding it, so I screwed and glued a piece of timber to the back of it, which gave me something to clamp to, and then I was able to use the plane, basically trace out the line around the bottom. This will need to be sanded off a bit because this is coming up at an angle and it was cut at 90 degrees. That's why there's that little kick out there, but that'll all get sanded down to be nice and smooth. That will get attached to there, and you can see I have one of my sticks there, and it's only clamped at one end. So to check that all the curves are nice and fair, you clamp it at one end and you sort of pull down on the other, and that'll give you the correct curvature, and you can see where it's high. So that's pretty close. See, it touches there. I haven't sanded that hoop there yet, so you can see it's not flat. But what I'll be able to do is I'll screw that tail block on, and then I'll be able to bend down my stick, and that'll give me the curvature that I need to shape this top. Yeah, you can see here where I haven't sanded it yet, it's still flat there, so there needs to be a little bit more taper in that. You can also see there this piece of timber, it's just a piece of pine, that's more or less straight up and down. I think it's actually getting a little bit wobbly, so it might not be completely vertical anymore, but you may just be able to see, I think the camera screws it up a bit, but this isn't quite vertical. There's about a 1 degree tip, I think, inwards. So that should all look quite nice when it's done, I think. Another good day's work, I think. Keep saying I'm going to have a break, but I haven't yet. But I'm starting to get pretty tired, and apparently I'm starting to look a bit worn out. So I just want to get this done, probably not the doors, but finish the main bits of the frame, and then I'll stop and do something else for a little bit, just have a break. But I got the tail done today, and the last timber piece in there, that's come out really well. So obviously I shaped the block with the file, and then went over it again with the belt sander. I took it outside this time. One thing I've found with the belt sanding is it's a little bit counterintuitive, but this is my belt sander here. If you're sanding a long thin piece, one of those rails, you would think it would make sense to go that way along the rail, but I actually find it easier if you go sideways, because what was happening was if you try to go lengthways, it's actually quite hard to keep this flat, and you end up with a curve on everything. And I found if I went sideways like that, I make this a bit thinner. So if this is our rail, if you sanded it that way, I found I could keep it flatter, if that makes sense, because it's easier to hold the tool because it's so long in the correct plane to keep that flat. Whereas if it's like this, it's easy to sort of roll it, and you end up with curves everywhere where you don't want them necessarily. So this just makes it so easy. Makes a big mess, but it's easily worth it. I can take the bulk off with the planes quite often, but for example, doing this tail piece, I couldn't plane the end because I'd left this high, and the plane would hit the end and chip the wood off. So that's with that piece in place. And I also fitted the little curve blocks that go around the corner of the axle openings. That's just to make it easier to hammer the aluminium skin around. That provides somewhere for the skin to wrap around. But that finishes it off quite nicely. It gives you a good idea of the curve there as well. But this might be tricky with one hand. I've got my bendy stick, which is actually getting a bit warped. But I use this and my steel rule to check that all the curves are actually correct and still nice and fair. And we can see if I clamp this at one end, again you can see how the back, well, you can see my stick's warped there, but there's a gap there because the back is still higher. And if you pull down this end here, you can sort of see that the stick touches everywhere along the body. And that means I've got a nice curve along there. There's not going to be any kinks or odd things going on, hopefully, when I make the skin. You do the same around the sides. The shape does get a little bit tricky around the axle opening, but that's not too much of a problem because it's just at the bottom it gets a little bit, the shape's a little bit awkward. But if it doesn't match from here to here, it doesn't really matter because that bit's cut out, obviously, and you can't see it. Because it's behind the wheel and there's axle and suspension and springs in the way, you won't notice if that isn't perfectly in line along the bottom. As long as this part here, and the tail all looks okay, it'll be fine. But through the middle, so all the way across there is a nice fair curve. I think it's looking pretty good. So if we get rid of that, and I've been saying this every single film for the last week, I still need to make those little blocks that go at the back of the door. But it's quite hard to really get an idea of the shape. But I think now with the tail on it, you do get a much better idea. And it's always a kind of funny transition, this, I find, where it goes from the curve to the tail, it'll kind of straighten out, which is what they do. So those tail panels might be interesting to make. The rest of it should be pretty straightforward. Things like the boot lid, that'll go in here. I did realize after I'd screwed these cross pieces in place that that might be exactly where the lock goes, but I may not actually use those budget locks on it, mainly because I don't really need to. I might just strap the tank down, or strap the lid down rather, just a leather strap like I've got on my Austin 7, so you don't really need lock mechanisms there. I don't know, it depends how they'd work, but I'm pretty sure I've got where the screws are is exactly where the little tongue of the locking mechanism would want to go. But it's getting there. I think now with the tail in place, that really shows the lines and what it's going to look like. A little bit hard to visualize, but I think that gives the overall idea. And I have gone over it once at least with the DA sander, just to smooth off the edges and break some of the corners, round off some of the corners and things like that. I think that's it for today. Okay, Riley frame day 627, well, it feels like it. I'm getting pretty close to being done with the main bits of the frame now. I still need to do the doors and the boot lid, of course, but today I worked on the door posts. Would they be called B-pillars in a car like this? I'm not sure, but where the door latches go, and that's just made off a couple of blocks. I used one thick block, and it was actually quite a bit of work to get all the angles correct. So it's sitting at an angle that way. It's got an angle there because it's not perpendicular. It's got an angle on the bottom, it's got an angle on the front. Basically, it's taken me all day to make these, slowly trimming them up. I made one small oversight. It's not really an error because I've got room to trim as usual. I cut these out on the bandsaw, the shape, but of course I cut them flat, which means this radius, that radius and the radius on the other side should be level across the car, of course, but they're not. So this line shows me how much I need to sand off there. That's fine because this is still big. I'll also put some epoxy or something in here just to stop the edges splitting and then sand it all nice and smooth. But you can see how this block is shaped, and somewhere I have a piece of aluminium. Now on the Brooklyns everything is very close and very tight. Once you start building them you realize how true that is. It's a very small car, not a lot of space, and a good example of that is down here where the castle nut on the spring shackle comes very close to the body. So you have to make sure there's enough clearance there, and that's a 1.6mm piece of aluminium. You can see I've got everything faired in nicely. There's clearance there, just enough. That doesn't move up and down obviously because it's fixed to the chassis, but it'll move in a small arc around there. And this is my little test piece of aluminium just to make sure everything's still fair curves all the way around. With both halves on the body, I can put a stick all the way down the side and everything lines up really well. That is the correct sort of angle. So if you look at pictures of these cars, the back edge of the door isn't vertical, it's actually tilted a little bit, and it has a very slight curve to it, which is what I've got there. The only place it gets kind of interesting is the way the door skin actually fits, because if we actually look at it, so this is the original door skin I have. You can see how the top folds over and the front folds over, and you can see where it's pinned, and the same on the curve on the top, but the bottom edge and the rear edge are folded. And the way that works is on the door skin you have a little piece of metal screwed to it that provides a flange, so the wooden frame comes up to here, which is why this is all rusted along the bottom. That's where the original is rusted out. So the timber frame comes to here, and then there's a piece of steel that's screwed onto it, and the sheet metal of the door skin is wrapped over that, and that's how they get it nice and thin. And the reason it has to be thin is because it kind of sits flush here and here, but the bottom edge, there's a lip that overlaps all of this and then up here. So I need to tweak the shape maybe a little bit down here, just so there isn't something weird going on here where the two halves of the body join. But it's one of those details where I'd need a really good close-up photo of an original car to see how they do it. But once you've got the door in there, it does kind of work. My opening is a little bit too short fractionally, but you can sort of see there how the door skin will overlap. The other thing I had to do, and I had to go back and check the originals, the chassis here has a bend right here. It's quite a sharp bend, but obviously the door doesn't. So I chopped off that corner. Basically I did a fair curve along here to get a nice curve on here that matches the door. And the door skin, you can see there is a little bit of a stick out on the chassis there, but that is exactly how they are. Looking at pictures of very original cars, they're like that too, and you can actually see that on the cars. So I think that curve is pretty much right now. You can see how the door skin matches, and you can see how the rear curve is pretty close. Like I say, it might need a little bit more tweaking just here. I might just shave a little bit off there. But once you've got the aluminium on there and that's wrapped around. I think it'll all fit quite nicely. This piece of aluminium just has a tiny bit of crown on it, just a little bit of curve really, not even crown. But you can see how it should be nice and smooth all the way along. Same down here. You can still see the barrel shape. That is correct. I haven't actually tried sitting in it yet to see where that places my elbow and my shoulder. But it's been a lot of work just getting to this stage, and I keep saying this, but I haven't done it yet. I need to take a little break. So maybe tomorrow I'll do something else. It's just so messy, the woodworking. I much prefer, so when I glued this block on, so you can see how that's 2 blocks, I just left that block fat. So I had to trim it, and I used the chisel. That's the first time I've actually used any chisels on this car, and chiseled away most of the waste, which worked really well. And then I used the belt sander just to fair it all in, smooth it all in. But I think that now looks pretty good. I'm actually tempted to roll the car outside onto the driveway and see what it looks like with the body in place there. I think it might be a little bit easier to get the overall idea of what it's looking like. But yeah, I'm pleased with how that's come out. So I've moved the car outside to have a look, and it just gave me a really good chance to vacuum the carpet it sits on. I try to keep the place pretty clean, which is a struggle sometimes, but it's not too bad at the moment. I had friends visit, an old school friend of mine. I haven't seen them for about at least 15 years. We were trying to figure it out, but it's been a long time. Did we clean the house? No, but I made damn sure I vacuumed the shed. So it was nice and clean in here. But what we actually want to see is the car. Oops. So with it outside, you can actually get a much better idea of the lines and how it's sitting. It looks pretty symmetrical, surprisingly. I do like how the tails come out. It's fairly long, but it matches the measurements of the originals. They did vary a bit, the body styles and the tail lengths and things like that. It also makes the door openings look really huge. They look very long, and I think that's just because the car is very low and long. But the openings are such that I can just get my legs through. It gives you an idea from the front as well. And you can really see the sort of barrel shape there. I think that looks good. Obviously it'll look different again once it's all panelled in aluminium and once it's got the doors and the boot lid in place. And I have to look at building the fuel tank, as I've mentioned before. Basically the fuel tank lives in here. Normally it's a circular tank, and the fuel filler neck actually comes up through the boot lid, So to get the boot lid off, you have to unscrew the filler cap and lift the lid off. And it's interesting. So it can't be a very big tank. I need to figure out the sort of sizes, because pictures of originals I've seen, the normal cars, the tanks are only about this high. So they're not very big. Of course, it could go down as low as the bottom of the chassis rails, so that gives you a little bit more height to play with. Remember that normally these cars would have a spare tyre sitting in the top there. Goodness knows how they fitted those. But that gives a pretty good idea of the shape. So now I have to roll it back in uphill. Just slightly uphill. I didn't drive it out, I just sort of rolled it out. But I think that's a good place to end, and I'm going to take a break from the car for a little bit, I think. Back inside now, there's just a couple of other things I should mention. The car, when it's finished, obviously the rear seat goes in there. There's a sort of cockpit combing that goes all the way around and down here. I may make this, I need to cut the insides of this a little bit thinner. Just in there, I just need to sort of thin that out so that that's an even width all the way around for the cockpit combing. And it kind of goes around here and around the top of the door and over the top of the door, which is good because I did try sitting in it and your elbow is sort of right where that corner is, basically. And the other last thing of note, I did measure, I did weigh it. The front half of the frame, and this is without the firewall, is about 6 kg at the moment. So it's actually pretty light. You can easily pick it up with one hand. The rear has a few more sticks in it, so it's a little bit heavier, but that was 16 kg. And that's how much it weighs at the moment. Is that good? Is that comparable to a real one? I don't know. Plus I still have to add all the steel brackets and things, so that'll get a little bit heavier again. But I think it's looking pretty good. The other thing I need to do, of course, is I'm going to make all of the brackets and figure out where they go. The main one is the ones that go around the axle opening. And then I will fit them in place, screw them in place temporarily, and then I'll have to take them all off, and then I'm going to treat the frame. And I have some preservative type material, type paint that you paint on, let that soak into the timber, and that should protect it. And then I will probably give the whole thing a coat of just black paint, just to keep it all neat and tidy and give it another layer of protection. My plans for the color of the car, usually you see them, and you see a lot of vintage cars like this where everything is painted body color. They literally just paint over everything. But I want to go for a slightly different look. I'm probably going to go with satin black for all the running gear and the chassis. So pretty much that same black that everything is already painted. So the chassis rails will be black. The body color, the color I have in mind is a very deep crimson-y red. The best way I can describe it is the sort of color that old British steam locomotives were. I think it was the Coronation Scott. There's a famous locomotive that's got a very deep maroon sort of color. And I kind of want that, and I don't want it too glossy. I don't want it flat. It needs to be kind of in the middle somewhere. That's what I'm thinking anyway, for the color of it. The interior, the leather, I don't know what color that should be then. Probably just black to go with the rest of everything else. And I think that's kind of it for now. The last thing, I promise, is a quick check to see if I got the line across the top at least correct. have I got a fair curve there. So just got a piece of brass tube across to represent where the bonnet hinge will go. You can see that's a straight line coming along to the scuttle. And then this is my big long bendy stick, and it's not actually clamped on, it's just sitting there. The clamp at the end is just to provide enough weight to pull it down, and you can see it pretty much lines up perfectly. So we're looking good there. And you can do the same trick. Obviously I can't do it on camera easily, with the stick clamped along the sides of the cars and the lines all match up perfectly. So that's really good.